Sin. Is it a legal problem or is it a relational problem? And does it matter when we're talking about forgiveness? Welcome to the First Christian Church mini message. Glad that you can join us. We've got a good question. We're going to be talking about forgiveness today, but if you're going to talk about forgiveness, got to figure out what sin is, and we've got to decide, so is sin a legal problem or is sin a relational problem? Let's go down both paths really quick. Let's say sin is a legal problem. So what we're saying is that Adam and Eve and everybody else broke God's law, and we deserve to be punished and suffer the consequences of our law. In that case, forgiveness is giving up the retribution, giving up the punishment for being able to do that. Let's go down this path. I would like to suggest that in this day and age, that looking at sin as a legal problem is not helpful. We all know court systems, at least here in the West, and living in Salina, Kansas, there's a court system, and I can guarantee you that if you were convicted by a judge and you're sitting in front of Judge Young or somebody else and the gavel says that you are guilty, it wouldn't matter if Jesus Christ himself showed up and walked to the front of the court and said, this person's guilty, but I'm going to take their punishment. Send me to prison. Don't send them to prison. It doesn't work that way. There's no judge who would do that. The criminal goes to jail to protect us and to suffer the consequences. Nobody can come forward and suffer the consequences on their behalf. And frankly, the Old Testament was that way as well. Now, you did offer sacrifices for sin and cover for sin, but if you deserved the death penalty, there was no amount of animals, there was nobody else who could suffer the consequences for you. So in terms of the Old Testament, I would like to suggest that the idea of sin is a richer concept. Now, how about sin as a relational problem? Aha! This works for us. I think it's more helpful nowadays because, let's face it, if sin is a relational problem, it makes a lot of sense to us. For example, I am blessed that I get to teach at a local university here in town. I'm teaching one class, and just yesterday, we were in class, and then I went to lunch over in the cafeteria. And lunch in the cafeteria, all of a sudden I saw one of the students, a guy who had missed the class. He did not look at me. He looked everywhere in that cafeteria except not to make eye contact with me. Why? Because our relationship was broken. He felt guilty that he hadn't gone to class, but obviously he's fine to come to lunch, and looking at that, he was not going to make eye contact with me because our relationship was broken. Well, if you know me at all, you know that after lunch I went by his table and said, hey man, how you doing? And made that eye contact. In that case, forgiveness makes a whole lot of sense. Because if forgiveness is giving up the right to hurt back, what that is saying is that I'm not going to do any retribution. I'm not going to hold him any more accountable or tell him he's a lazy college student and he better get his act together. These things happen. I'm not going to try and do retribution, because if I do retribution and try to punish him for missing class, it's like, what's the big deal? I'm just going to drive a wedge and make the relationship worse. So I'd like to suggest that God, through Jesus Christ, considers our sin a relational problem. And what does God do? God shows up and says, hey, I love you. Because we're all like, oh, I've sinned against God. I haven't loved God. I haven't loved my neighbor. I'm going to keep my heads down. I'm not going to look at God. I'm not going to approach God. I'm not going to go near God because God wants to kick my butt. And so I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to keep my eyes down. And so instead, God shows up and says, hey, I love you. That's what God did through Jesus Christ. I love you. I'm going to give you compassion. I'm going to give you healing. I'm going to give you forgiveness. I love you. And remember that old story of, I asked Jesus how much he loved me, and he reached out his arms and he died. That's the symbol. of exactly how far God is going to go to love you, to bring you back together when the sin has broken the relationship. God shows up over and over again because God absolutely loves you. That's what forgiveness is all about. I hope that you'll open your arms and receive that forgiveness for the forgiveness of the God who loves you. God bless. You're worth it.